Hey everyone, what's up? Are you 100 here? I am coming today with a very unusual content. As you may know me, I'm normally creating very offensive security content, kernel exploitation, reverse engineering. I had some OSCP series or similar CTF-ish videos so far. Lately, I've been more into AWS security, container security, more cloud side of things. So there are very good videos out there created by all the experts, but I thought, why not? There's all this audience that knows me, so today we're gonna work on a privilege escalation playground for AWS IAM created by BishopFox. All the credit goes to them. So I'm just gonna first set up the environment, and then I'm gonna create my AWS account and few requirements that's needed to solve this playground, and we're gonna solve some of the privilege escalation scenarios as part of the first video. As you may know, I don't like to chat much in these videos, so let's get started. So we're gonna start with the setup. Okay, so first of all, we're gonna create an AWS account if you don't have it already. It's also mentioned here in the quick start section in the GitHub page for this I am vulnerable app. So I already have an AWS account, so I'm skipping this part. It says that create a non-root user with administrative access that you will use when running Terraform. Cool. So I'm gonna go to IAM service. You can just go to the services or in the search button. You can create a user group and then add the user to that as well. I'm creating the user group as administrators, and I'm just gonna give the administrator access to the group. Scroll down and create group very quickly. Great, and then we can create our administrator user and add it to this user group. We see the permissions, we verify it in here. And let's do the next step. Next, we want to create credentials, access key for this user. You can go to security credentials, scroll down until you see access keys, and we will create an access key in here. We want the use case to be command line interface. So you can just click the first option here. We need to click on confirmation button and then say next. We need to give the description tag value, call it Terraform key, and create access. You need to download or save this access key and secret access key values, because if you don't, you won't be able to see the secret access key once it's created. Safest way is to download the CSV file and save it in a safe place. To-do list, and we need to install the AWS client, command line install, AWS CLI, and then we're just copying and pasting the comments as given in the AWS documentation. Quite straightforward, just copying and pasting, and if there are any errors, of course you need to investigate, troubleshoot, but here we don't have any, so quickly install an AWS client. We can also verify if it's installed in here with the version as well. Next thing we will do is we will configure our AWS environments. It will be prompted with AWS key and secret key. I'm just skipping this part for confidentiality. And then we can just verify it with AWS STS get caller identity, which will show us user ID, account, and ARN. Awesome. After we get these values, the next thing we need to do is installing Terraform binary and adding the binary to our location path. Unfortunately, I already done this for other projects, so I won't do it in here, but it's very straightforward in this documentation that's linked here. The next thing I will do is I will be cloning the repo from the GitHub for I am vulnerable, our project that we will work on, change to that directory and start Terraform in here. We'll just do Terraform init. After that, we can check with Terraform plan to see what kind of changes will be made. But this is optional if you trust that everything will go right. In this case, since this is a CTF, you can just type Terraform apply. Let's wait until it's done. It can take a few minutes. Once it's done, we can just copy our AWS credentials file in a backup file to make sure that we can go back to it later, because we will be adding a lot of profile, a lot of users in our credentials files. It also mentions some stuff here, which resources to be added, if it's gonna cost something, these kind of things. So you can also read this page. It's very useful, gives a lot of information. And let's get started with the first privilege escalation scenario. All right, in the users list, first we are going to go to Esc1. It should be in the second tab. There are a lot of users here. We can just click on the policy and see the format, see the content by clicking JSON. So we're seeing it in here, very usual policy, the versions given, statements given, these are must. The action is IAM create policy version, which will allow us to do privilege escalation. We will see in a second. The effect is allow, and resources is for all. This is dangerous. We will see why it's dangerous. We can read it in the original documentation, or you can see it in the other website as well. This action basically allows us to update a given policy to another version with this excessive permissions. What we're going to do is we will use the following command: AWS IAM create policy version, policy IRN, which is given in the policies page for this policy document. I'm just given the document from my local priv.json, and we are attaching the profile. If we refresh the page and go into the policy and checking for the policy's version, as you can see, we just updated the policy version with our own policy as the version 2, and it's the default policy now, which it allows everything, affects the law of action as all, and resource all. So we escalated our privileges just like that. Next, go to the second one, privesc2. So this is our second user and the policy attached to it. Let's see what the policy content says. So it says the action that we are allowed to on any resource is IAM set default policy version. If you go to the AWS documentation, it gives us what it means. We will set the specified version of specified policy as the policy's default version. It's very similar to the previous one. Let's see how we're going to do that. So I just created this JSON file. Visual editor is basically if you go to AWS and try to update the policy. So I'm just giving it as the SID, Visual Editor 0 and Visual Editor 1, which will basically update the policy for us. We can also do it on the browser, but if you're using client, that would be our way to do it. And the new policy is given the effect allow on all action, all resource, basically full administrator access. So the command is also very simple, straightforward, AWS and then service name, IAM, and set default policy version, which is associated with this action. And then we will give the ARN. I already done the privilege escalation, so you're seeing it in here, but anyway, we're given the ARN for this policy. It's accessible in the policies page for the specific policy that we're talking about in here. We will give the version, which will be the second version. Version ID is v2, and the profile here is privesc2. I will show it in a second. Where am I getting these profile information? It's basically coming from AWS credentials file. And as you can see, the version 2 of the policy, the current default version, is allowing us to do anything administrator access. So we escalated our privileges just like that. Let's jump into privesc3. Let's find our user first. It's in the second tab. Let's click on it. Let's see the associated policy. We can just like expand it in here. So there are multiple actions. That's a new one. There's IAM pass role. There is some actions associated with EC2, describe instances, run instances, create key pair. Okay, so we have a couple of actions that's allowed on any resource EC2 related. One thing we can do is there's a tool called PMapper that I'm just showing it in here. You can use this basically to see the paths for privilege escalation. I'm not going to show it in here. It takes a while to set it up, but it will give us basically to see the opportunities for privilege escalation scenarios. And in this case, there is a and in this case, it will show us that we can reach a role, priv high priv service via EC2. So this result will come from PMapper. There are discussions around that because our current user is actually not allowed to get this information by running PMapper. So we're assuming this is a pen test and we have multiple credentials, and then via that we're enumerating the environment and we're getting this information. So the current user doesn't have that. That's why I'm not showing it in the scenario. But we're assuming that we have this information. Cool. So the next scenario that we're going to do is we're going to run instances. So we're going to run instances. The easiest way to get this information is just say launch instance and get the MIA information just like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to type the following command: AWS EC2 run instances. Image ID is, like I mentioned, just from there, launch instance, and check for any operating system. For instance, I check for Ubuntu, and the latest version, it just gives me the MIA. And the instance type, you can again see it in the user interface. It's basically just c2.micro. It's a free version. Free type, sorry. And then IAM instance profile, that's the profile that I'm talking about that came from PMapper. And then user data, we're gonna give it a bash shell that I just created in my current working directory. I will show the file content just in a bit. It's basically one-liner bash shell. And the region, I write it in here, but I will correct it in a second in the video. I actually wrote the wrong region. Okay, so basically what we're gonna do is when we run this instance, we're gonna get a shell on an EC2 instance or any server that we're listening. And we're connecting to our EC2 instance or any server that you have that have a public IP address that you can listen to. I'm just gonna listen on port 80 because I also set this network settings in a way that all ports are open and it's accessible on internet, which is very bad practice actually. When I run this, yeah, I'm showing it in here. There's an error message. It's actually very good because if you see it, now you know how to fix it. First, we need to write a profile, which is PrivEsc3 that we need to mention. That's coming from the AWS security credentials file. And then I realized that I'm actually in a different region. So that was a really nice exercise because you should never assume the default. Right, when I run this, I will wait for a few seconds for the instance to start. And when I wait, as you can see, connection received as root. Just created EC2 instance on the attack scenario. We got a shell. Just like that. You can also see the information in here under metadata, which is the profile that we use to escalate privileges. Quite straightforward, super cool. Imagine you're getting a shell by running an EC2 instance, so quite cool. All right, we're jumping into privilege escalation 4. Let's see the fourth user. We are checking the policy associated with it, and we have action IAM create access key. Let's check the documentation and see what we can do with that. We can basically allow to create access key for other users. It's quite dangerous since we have resources all on this action. So there are some requirements for this attack to work. First, we need to know a username for a high privilege user. For instance, in this case, we have a user called admin access, and this is how we're going to escalate our privileges. We will say AWS and then service name IAM, and then the option, which is profile -- profile, we're giving it PrivEsc4, and then the option that we're using here is create access key, and the username that we're given. First, I'm going to give a non-existing username to see like what kind of error we're getting. We can just call it administrator. Maybe we're trying to like brute force it or anything. But I'm just showing it in here. There is an administrator user with administrator access. And in order for this attack to work, you need to have this knowledge. All right, as you can see in here, and the policy name associated with it is AWS managed policy. It's a default policy called administrator access. That's very cool. We can just use this username to get our privilege escalation to be done. When we write a default name like administrator, it won't work as this user does not exist. Then if you know this username, Terraform, who is an administrator user, you can just get the access key ID, secret access key, all this information. So it's quite cool. You can just use AWS configure for profile. We can just create a new profile like that. And then the key ID and the secret access key, we can just write it down here and add this profile to our configuration file. We can use this command AWS STS get caller identity for the given profile to get account ID, user ID, and other information as well. Also, the next scenario is ProResc 5, the fifth user. Let's find the user first. That's another very dangerous case in here. If you look at the JSON format, as you can see, it's IAM create login profile. If you look at the documentation, this basically allows us to create a login password for any user. As you can imagine, that's a very dangerous thing. So we're just attaching the profile and the options create login profile, username, as we know, the administrator user, Terraform, and we're just setting a password for this user. Super dangerous. At this point, we can run the following command to get the account ID or account alias, which will allow us to log into the AWS console. If we run this command, we will get the account ID and we have the username and password that we just set. So we can just go to the incognito or private window on the browser. And since we're not going to get the session for the current AWS account, we're just going to write the account ID for the IAM user that we just get in from here, from this comment, and then username should be Terraform. We already know that this is the administrator user, and the password should be what we just said. It's quite scary, huh? That's another privilege escalation technique. Cool. All right, so let's start the ProResc 6. Let's go there. We find under the users tab. Let's look at the policies, and what we have is IAM update login profile. It's another very similar scenario to the previous one. What we're gonna do is we can change the password for the specified IAM user, and the resources is on all users, so it's quite dangerous. Quite similar to the previous scenario. We can just do the very similar. We can just send a very similar comment in order to escalate our privileges. Since we are aware of this username, and like I said, we need to have the knowledge of an administrator user in order to exploit this scenario. So it's a very similar comment as the previous one, AWS IAM, which is the service name, and the comment here is update dash login dash profile as given in our JSON file in the policy, and dash dash username, the user that we already know, Terraform, the password that we just set, any password that we want. We can also give the option no password reset required, which is an additional option for the profile that we're going to give as ProResc 6. As I mentioned, these are all coming from our initial setup, the profiles that we just set for each user. When we do that, we did not get an error prompt. It's usual for this comment. That means that it worked. We can again do the very similar scenario like the previous one, get the account ID and try to connect in the browser to the Terraform account, and go to the browser with the incognito window or private window to connect without the current session. We're signing in, account ID since this IAM user, and then the password and username as we know, the Terraform, and then the password is, that's what we just set. As you can see, now we logged in as the Terraform user who has administrator privileges. Next scenario, PrivEsc 11. I skipped some of them. That doesn't mean that I'm not gonna do it. They are all gonna come in the next videos. Cool, PrivEsc 11. So let's look at the policy and the content of it. Let's see what it says. And it is IAM put group policy. Cool, let's see what we can do with this policy, with this action. So if we look at the documentation, it tells us what we can do with this action and how we're going to use it. Let's see quickly. We're going to type AWS IAM put group policy, and let's see how we're going to exploit that. We need to give a group name with no or less privilege permissions, users, and then this user that we are in the group PrivEsc 11 put group policy group. So in order for this attack to work, we need to have a group with no or less privilege permissions. And we will give the policy name. You can call it anything. Let's call it test or anything that you want. We can define it anything. And then we need to have the profile, which will be PrivEsc 11. And then we also need to give the policy documentation. We can create it in our local and just give it like that policy document. It should be with the following content. So here is also the admin.json file that I created with the full administrator privileges. And let's see how will it look like. We're just giving it in here with this syntax, and the policy name is test. So since it did not give me any error messages, if we check here on the policy is just edit the test that we are talking about. And in this way, we also exploited the privileges in here to administrator privileges. So that was the end of the video. I included a couple of scenarios, including the setup as well. I focused mostly on different IAM actions that allows us to escalate privileges. I think that's a super cool resource from BishopFox that allow us to see different misconfigurations, how to escalate them. They also have a very cool blog post that they also give very cool hints and solutions in their website if you want to check it. Stay tuned until the next video where I cover other services and other misconfigurations that's given by this little CTF. Cheers, guys!